The room smelled like cigarette smoke and ambition. Detroit, 1980. Inside the offices of a label that had built itself on the backs of artists it would just as quickly discard, a decision was being made, not in whispers, in broad daylight, with the confidence of men who believed they controlled the future of sound. Marvin Gaye was gone, not dead, but effectively erased. The IRS had come knocking. The marriages had unraveled into legal warfare. The cocaine had become a daily ritual rather than an occasional escape. And somewhere in the machinery of the music industry, someone had already started looking for a replacement. His name was Theodore Derice Pendergrass. Teddy, 29 years old, built like the answer to every question the industry had about what comes after Marvin. He had the voice, deep, warm, gravitational. He had the presence, commanding, sensual, dangerous in the way that made women lose their composure entirely. He had left Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes and gone solo, and within a year the industry had made its decision. They called him the new Prince of Soul, not behind closed doors, in print, in interviews, on the radio, where DJs would segue from his records into conversations about legacy and succession, as if Marvin were already a chapter in a history book rather than a man still breathing somewhere across an ocean. Teddy filled the arenas. He filled them with women who threw room keys onto the stage. He filled them with the kind of screaming that Marvin used to generate just by walking to the microphone and closing his eyes. The label executives loved him. He was reliable, promotable, commercial in all the ways that Marvin had stopped being the moment he decided he wanted to talk about Vietnam and the dying of the innocent. Teddy didn't complicate things. Teddy delivered. And for a moment, a long, comfortable, profitable moment, it seemed like the transition had been seamless, like soul music had simply found a new vessel and moved on. Nobody asked what Marvin thought about it. Nobody had to. He was in Ostend, Belgium, sitting in a sparse apartment above the North Sea, watching the water and trying to remember what it felt like to want something. But somewhere beneath the cocaine haze and the legal terror and the weight of a grief he had never properly named, something old and unextinguishable was still burning. And the industry, so confident in its replacement, so comfortable with its new prince, had no idea what was about to walk back in through the door. The executives who had written Marvin off did not understand the fundamental difference between a voice that sounds like soul and a voice that is soul. Teddy Pendergrass could move a room. That was never in question. But moving a room and stopping time are two entirely different things. And Marvin Gaye had always belonged to the second category. There is a quality in certain voices that exists below the level of technique, beneath the training, beneath the control, beneath everything a producer can shape or a vocal coach can refine. It is the sound of a person who has survived something and decided to sing about it anyway. Teddy had the gift. Marvin had the wound. And wounds, when channeled correctly, produce a frequency that no imitation can replicate. While Teddy was collecting platinum records and selling out Madison Square Garden, Marvin was in a small Belgian studio at 2 a.m, recording a drum machine pattern over and over until it felt like a heartbeat rather than a metronome. He was broke. He was paranoid. He was convinced that the CIA had listening devices planted in his apartment walls and that his phone lines were monitored and that the same government he had questioned in his music had turned its quiet attention towards silencing him permanently. None of this was entirely rational. All of it was entirely real to him. And out of that paranoia, out of that isolation, out of that desperate need to feel something other than the slow erosion of his own identity, a song began to take shape in the dark. He called it Sexual Healing, and when it was finished, it sounded like nothing else in the world. Not because it was complicated, because it was honest in the way that only desperate things are honest, stripped of performance and pretense, and the careful management of image that the industry had spent 2 decades applying to him like a coat of paint over something it didn't fully understand. The drum machine pulsed. His voice came in low, almost conversational, and then opened into something that couldn't be explained by the notes he was hitting or the words he was singing. It came from somewhere below all of that. It always did with Marvin. The record dropped in September 1982. Radio programmers who had spent 2 years enthusiastically spinning Teddy Pendergrass records heard it and went quiet for a moment. Then they played it again, and again. It moved differently than anything else on the charts. It wasn't competing with what was popular. It was operating in an entirely separate register, the way a cello sounds different from a violin, not because one is better, but because one goes deeper. DJs who had been calling Teddy the new Marvin suddenly found themselves in the uncomfortable position of playing the old Marvin immediately after, and the contrast was not unkind to Teddy. It was simply clarifying. This is what the original sounds like. This is the difference between the throne and the man who built it with his bare hands. By early 1983, the industry had quietly retired the phrase, "New Marvin Gaye." Nobody announced the decision. Nobody wrote a retraction. It simply stopped appearing in press releases and radio copy and magazine profiles, the way a rumor stops when the truth shows up in the same room. Teddy was still Teddy, still extraordinary, still one of the great voices of his generation, but he was no longer positioned as a successor. The succession had been interrupted. The original had returned, and everything had reorganized itself accordingly, without ceremony, without apology, with the silent efficiency of a universe correcting a temporary error. There is a particular cruelty in being declared finished while you are still alive. Not dead, not retired, not even silent, just absent. Marvin had gone quiet in the way that a fire goes quiet when the wind drops, still burning, but no longer visible from a distance. The industry read his silence as surrender. It was not surrender, it was compression, the kind that happens when everything external has been stripped away and a person is left alone with the one thing they cannot bargain or drink or medicate away, which in Marvin's case was the fact that he was built to make music, and the music was still in there, unfinished, waiting with the patience of something that has no deadline because it knows it will outlast everything else. The Grammy Awards, February 27, 1983. The Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. The room that night held a specific kind of electricity, the kind that accumulates when an industry that had moved on is forced to acknowledge it moved too quickly. Marvin was nominated. Marvin won. Best Male R&B Vocal Performance. Best R&B Song. He walked to the stage in that particular way of his, unhurried, slightly detached, as if observing himself from a slight distance and finding the whole spectacle mildly interesting. He accepted the awards with the measured grace of a man who had expected this, not because he was arrogant, but because he knew exactly what he had made and what it meant. There was no triumphalism in his face. There was something quieter. Confirmation. Teddy Pendergrass was in that room. There are no dramatic accounts of a confrontation, no documented exchange of charged words, no cinematic moment of reckoning between the two men. What there was something quieter and more permanent than any confrontation could have been. The industry had run an experiment. It had tried to answer the question of whether soul music could survive without its most complicated, most difficult, most irreducibly human practitioner. And the answer had come back in the form of a single record, a drum machine, a synthesizer, and a vocal that sounded like it was being received rather than performed. The experiment was over. The results required no interpretation. What made Marvin unreplaceable had nothing to do with technique. Teddy had technique in quantities that most singers only dream about. It had nothing to do with charisma or stage presence or the physical magnetism that both men possessed in full measure. It had to do with something that cannot be manufactured, trained, marketed, or transferred from one vessel to another. The particular texture of a human being who has been broken in specific ways and has decided to let the breaking be audible. Marvin sang from a place that existed below performance. He sang from the part of himself that his father had tried to silence, and Motown had tried to contain, and the industry had tried to replace with someone easier to manage. And because that place was entirely his own, born from his particular history, his particular damage, his particular and stubborn refusal to be entirely destroyed, it produced a sound that belonged to no one else on earth. Teddy Pendergrass would go on to face his own tragedy, his own shattering, his own long reckoning with the limits of the body and the permanence of loss. His story would take its own devastating turn in 1982, and he would carry himself through it with a dignity that earned its own kind of quiet reverence. He was never diminished by the comparison the industry had forced upon him. The framing had never been his idea. He was simply a man with an extraordinary voice who got caught in the machinery of a narrative that wasn't really about him. A narrative about the industry's need to believe that genius is replaceable, that the specific gravity of a particular human soul can be approximated closely enough that the audience won't notice. The audience noticed. They always notice. Not consciously, not with the vocabulary of music theory or the language of cultural analysis. They notice the way a body notices temperature. Something in the nervous system registers the difference between warmth and heat, between proximity and contact, between a voice that is reaching for a feeling and a voice that is coming from one. Marvin Gaye's audience had spent 2 years being offered a very good approximation, and then the real thing came through the radio at them, and every cell in their bodies understood the distinction simultaneously and immediately, and without any deliberate thought at all. That is the thing about genuine originality. It doesn't argue for itself. It doesn't need to. It simply exists at a frequency that makes every substitute instantly audible for what it is. Not inferior exactly, but adjacent. Near the thing. In the neighborhood of the thing, not the thing itself. Marvin was always the thing itself, and no amount of industry confidence, no volume of sales figures, no number of sold-out arenas with room keys thrown at the stage could change what happened the moment his voice came back into the conversation. The conversation reorganized itself. The hierarchy reasserted itself. Not cruelly, simply truthfully. In the years since, the story of Teddy Pendergrass has been told as tragedy. The accident, the paralysis, the long aftermath of a life reshaped by circumstance, it deserves to be told with the full weight of its complexity and its grace. But there is another chapter in Teddy's story that gets less attention, and it is this. For a period of years, at the peak of his powers, he was asked to be someone else, to carry a name that wasn't his, to fill a space whose true dimensions were determined not by the stage or the arena or the record sales, but by something interior and unreachable and ultimately non-transferable. He did everything right. He was extraordinary at his own thing. The problem was never Teddy. The problem was the premise. You cannot replace a frequency. You can't approximate it. You can get close enough that in the absence of the original, people will accept the approximation and even love it. Because the need the frequency meets does not go away just because the source does. But the moment the original returns, even diminished, even damaged, even paranoid and broke, and recording in a Belgian studio with a rented drum machine, the approximation reveals itself as exactly that. And the world, without quite knowing why, exhales. Have you ever watched someone try to fill a space that simply wasn't shaped for them, and then watch the person it was shaped for walk back in and make the whole room different just by being there? Tell us in the comments what you hear when Marvin's voice comes through.